Just a few housekeeping notes. I am a political economist, so for all of you out there who don't spend the majority of your time with your head stuck in the stratosphere of high politics, this talk is essentially guided by the geopolitical situation unfolding ahead of us. And so the specific policy content might seem a bit light at the time, though I'm looking forward to digging into those details later into the Q&A. So this talk is based on my forthcoming research article in the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal, which should be out in the next week or so, the citation for which will be listed at the end if you're interested in learning more. Essentially, we are witnessing a momentous and unprecedented moment in the post-colonial period in which it is possible, arguably for the first time, to actualize an emancipatory development vision for the region. So just a brief backgrounder on the existing institutional ecosystem into which the new strategic partnership is entered. Throughout the post-colonial period, Canada and CARICOM have affirmed a continuous special relationship rested on political, cultural, and economic affinities derived from a common British imperial lineage. Since 1979, the material aspects of bilateral relations have been governed by the Canada-CARICOM Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement, or the TECA, which stands as the overarching framework for intra-regional trade and development. The TECA governs preferential trade provisions that exempt CARICOM goods, and only goods, not services or investments, from import duties upon entering the Canadian market. It also includes more comprehensive protocols on goods like rum, as well as investment treaties between Canada and individual CARICOM states. Currently, that's only two, Trinidad and Barbados. In 1986, the TECA was enhanced by the Canadian Program for Commonwealth Caribbean Trade, or the CARIB-CAN, which extended preferential trade provisions to a host of new goods like clothing, textiles, and agricultural goods beyond what was already covered in the TECA. Since the CARIB-CAN was introduced, approximately 96% of CARICOM goods imported to Canada are exempted from import duties. At its inception, the CARIB-CAN was christened as an official embodiment of the mutually venerated special relationship, and thus embodies the institutional core of that historic bilateral continuum. In 2009, negotiations commenced for a Canada-CARICOM Free Trade Agreement, or FTA, which sought to incorporate trade and services and investments into a formalized free trade agreement, as those issue areas had become quite prominent in the years since the CARIB-CAN was initially negotiated. Despite joint affirmation that the FTA should be flexible enough to account for existing developmental asymmetries between Canada and CARICOM member states, agreement over its actual operating scope and the extent of trade liberalization versus retained protections for CARICOM remained elusive right through to the culmination of negotiations in 2014. The half-decade intervening the aborted free trade agreement talks and COVID-19 marked one of two historic low points for official bilateral relations in the post-colonial period. In 2021, exploratory talks commenced in earnest for a Canada-CARICOM strategic partnership that came to fruition last October. At its core, the new strategic partnership embodies two overarching goals, one practical and one aspirational. The practical goal encompasses two more discrete objectives. First, it serves as a permanent mechanism for extended dialogue as well as ad hoc consultations on policy priorities of common interest, pertaining primarily to issues of trade, security, development, and other foreign policies in general. Secondly, the strategic partnership seeks to enhance the long-standing special relationship through regular executive-level meetings geared toward advancing the implementation of collaboratively devised policy roadmaps. In its aspirational goal, the strategic partnership serves as a unified normative response to an evolving geopolitical environment. Quoting directly from the press release by Global Affairs Canada, the post-colonial relationship has evolved into an enduring strategic partnership amongst equals based on a shared commitment to democracy, the rule of law, respect for human rights, and the rules-based international order. As of now, efforts toward operationalizing the new strategic partnership remain ongoing. In particular, a working policy agenda is still in the works. Although much remains to be done, preliminary discussions have brought promising signs of renewal for what has become an increasingly listless continuum of post-colonial relations as of late. These include talks for a new Canada-CARICOM Chamber of Commerce and more effective use of existing bilateral facilities. In conjunction with these specific policy recommendations, there are several new and outstanding issues that need to be addressed in order to actualize a substantive new era of bilateral cooperation that the partnership seeks to foster. So, issues outstanding since the free trade era, for issues that Canada either has for which the imperative either lies with Canada entirely or overwhelmingly, are the need to expand current preferential trade provisions for CARICOM exports to services and investments. Those were key parts of the aborted free trade agreement negotiation. And so there's only a bilateral investment treaty between Canada and a few states. Meanwhile, services are not covered at all, and this would benefit in particular the Eastern Caribbean states, where services comprise over 50% of their exports. Next, in conjunction with expanding the level of trade between Canada and CARICOM, any future arrangements must take into account the need for ongoing protection for vulnerable CARICOM industries vis-a-vis more powerful global competitors. Though the precise register of vulnerable sectors varies amongst the CARICOM membership, agricultural and infrastructural services pertaining to inputs for other manufacturing and service industries stood out as vulnerable sectors across the region during the late FTA negotiations. Lastly, Canada must work toward reforming its approach to naturalized persons convicted of serious criminal offenses in Canada. There are currently no general statistics on this, though the problem is indicated by Jamaica's position in 2018 as #1 on the list of countries refusing to take back nationals accused of crimes in Canada, serious crimes in Canada. Earlier data showed that Jamaica alone received just under 3,000 deportees per year between 2001 and 2004 from the US, Canada, and the UK, during which time its total prison population was just under 5,000. For starters, Canada can help by making exceptions for countries lacking infrastructural capacity to accept deported convicts and/or contributing funds toward helping people integrate into small island communities in which they often lack any social connections. Beyond that, there are various things Canada can do domestically that fall outside of the rubric of foreign policy making. For CARICOM, renewed efforts must be made for identifying and realizing opportunities at integrating member state firms into Canadian value chains. CARICOM has traditionally viewed Canada as a distant tertiary trading partner compared with much larger markets like the United States and European Union. And partially this is because issues facing CARICOM suppliers seeking to access Canadian markets really boil down to an opaque regulatory environment stemming from differentiated business regulations amongst Canada's regionally bifurcated marketplace, as well as a lack of foreseeable corporate complementarities. This is something for which a new Chamber of Commerce could really provide some muscle by helping to clarify these as well as specific value chain complementarities amongst Canadian and CARICOM firms for joint venturing. Moving on to more recent issues, Canada's program for temporary foreign workers, which the Government of Canada has sought to expand when the strategic partnership was initially signed, has lately been singled out by the UN, unfortunately, as, quote, a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. This obviously does not bode well for the strategic partnerships' human rights aspiration, and so any future attempts to expand the program must be accompanied by significant programmatic reforms. Last but by no means least, substantive renewal of bilateral relations requires a new developmental vision. This initiative must come from the CARICOM side. Since the 1980s, when the CARICOM was ratified, bilateral relations have been overwhelmingly biased towards the use of market-based mechanisms for driving growth and development. Conversely, today's geopolitical environment offers a rare opportunity for pursuing the kind of state-based indicative planning. This is an interchangeable term I'm going to be using as nation building. I've heard other people use that term in the conference, so I'm going to slowly or sharply pivot to using the term nation building, that was disregarded with the pivot towards a more rigid market-based or neoliberal developmental ethos in the 1980s. So just a few examples of what this could potentially look like. On the more traditional the side of the more traditional trade-based arrangements we've been used to, the CARICOM EU Partnership Agreement includes specific development provisions per negotiated subject area. So these include things like labor and environmental minimum standards that could go a long way to mitigating some of the structural asymmetries that the late free trade agreement was unable to reconcile. Next are more cutting-edge, mission-oriented development strategies, utilizing state-led nation-building policies geared toward an overarching set of goals or missions for achieving sustainable development. These function on an individual state-level basis rather than through a regional program per se, and are basically what the UK, US, and EU are doing today in terms of their industrial policies. Think Keir Starmer's 5 missions in the United Kingdom. Barbados is actually in the process of implementing one of these right now through the use of new policy tools, building up the capacity of the public service, rather than over-reliance on private consultancies, and attempting to implement a whole-of-government approach geared toward fostering a new social contract rather than relying strictly on market-based mechanisms geared toward attracting foreign investors. Lastly is the idea of an old CARICOM developmental state, which basically entails coordinating regional foreign policies vis-a-vis foreign actors and foreign investors through a supranational regional diplomatic mechanism, though this project has remained elusive throughout the entire post-colonial period. So this might be the largest leap of faith. The opportunity in meeting these policy challenges are twofold awaiting Canada and CARICOM. First and foremost, reconciling these issues would go a very long way toward renewing what has lately become a rather listless bilateral relationship. Relatedly, doing so would foster a more equitable developmental bargain on which the bilateral relationship turns. Through its market orientation to trade and development relations, the CARICOM embodies a neoliberal developmental ethos that has so far failed to deliver meaningful developmental outcomes. I think these have been discussed at length today in the past couple days, so I'm going to skip over the statistics there. Basically, we're at a critical juncture in which the new strategic partnership could help foster a new, more equitable developmental ethos along the lines that I've just discussed. The incentives for doing so are as follows. For Canada's part, incentives are primarily related to geopolitical and soft power considerations, issues that have traditionally dominated its foreign policy making in the region. For instance, when the CARICOM was devised, it was done so largely in the image of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, launched by the United States several years prior to when the CARICOM was signed, by a Canadian federal government looking to harmonize its foreign policies with that of the US Reagan administration. Similarly, the Government of Canada routinely pledges technical support, and in one outstanding case, direct military support for hemispheric security initiatives since the 1980s in earnest. The new strategic partnerships' aspirational goal effectively hinges its credibility on a more equitable variant of the liberal international order that was created in 1945, which Western powers like Canada and the US have sought to reaffirm in the midst of an intensifying US-China rivalry and Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So liberal international order is a term that's interchangeable with rules-based order that was inserted directly into the language of the agreement. A more equitable strategic partnership with more aggressive public sector supports for CARICOM developmental outcomes would also go a long way toward restoring Canada's hemispheric reputation as a humanitarian force for good. It has long been viewed by both in the region and the hemisphere more generally as a geopolitical adjunct of foreign policy. The cost for Canada of doing so is quite low relative to the prospective geopolitical gains. At similar historical junctures as the one we are at now, Canada has consistently prioritized larger trade deals outside of the region for good reason. In the 1980s, there was a pivot towards the Pacific Rim amongst advanced industrialized economies. In the 1980s and 90s, the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and the NAFTA were the priority. And in the post-2010 period was the CETA with Europe. So it just makes sense to prioritize larger markets. But in this case, the relative small size of CARICOM countries becomes an asset because the economic cost of actually pushing an innovative strategic partnership like this is quite low relative to the asymmetrical size of the different economies. For CARICOM members, the incentive here is a new shot at moving toward autonomous political and economic development that is yet to be realized in the post-colonial era. The gains to be had from such an approach include a revitalized era of bilateral cooperation that the strategic partnership explicitly seeks to foster, bolstering the moral legitimacy of the rules-based order, and this is my last point here, so, and creating the basis for a new developmental model between global North and South states in an era of geopolitical polarization unfolding ahead of us. And thank you for your time.